The city of Valmir was made of air and memory. Its lattice bridges arced between floating calderas, its gardens grew in pockets of warm wind, its libraries were grown from crystal that sang when you stroked it. The Ivori built upward the way other species built outward, trusting the updraft the way sailors trust a keel. On the last day their towers rang with the alarm tongue, and the skies that had been their home for 10,000 generations, turned flat and hushed, as if sound itself had been given a curfew. They called it the null tide the first time it ate a star on the far side of the arm. Not a beast, not a fleet, not a god in a book. A front, a creeping correction. It did not burn or bite, it equalized. Heat gradients fell, spins slowed, bonds loosened, data bled to noise. Engines went quiet. Choirs lost their harmonics mid-phrase. When the tide touched a world, it took away the difference that made anything alive. It left behind matter in perfect boredom. Elder Sarael balanced in the high rotunda of the last conservatory, her wing veins catching eddies of thinning warmth from the failing climate towers. Her apprentices clustered around the mnemonic arc, a sphere of matter proofed against boredom by an art that had cost a civilization's adolescence to invent. We grew in the generosity of an imperfect universe, Sarael told them. We owe back a disproportionate debt. Below them, the engineers in their anchor suits clamped the arc into the neutrino coupler, a device that had sat in the heart of the conservatory for centuries while being called impractical, expensive, and paranoid. The arc had swallowed the Ivori. Their hydrodynamics, their poems to the updraft, their ethics of buoyancy and restraint, their star maps, their mistakes, the taste of fermented rain fruit, the impulse to build music out of weather. And more than culture, work, equations and hardware plans for resonant contraptions that didn't fight the tide head-on, but sang the universe into remembering it had texture. Power, called the chief engineer. The rotunda dimmed as the city gave up its last batteries. The coupler woke with a sound you felt in bone, a scale that began at 0 and climbed a half step each breath. In the transparency beneath their feet, Sarael could see the null tide washing the lower canyons. The fountains didn't splash anymore. They rose as one sheet and then settled into a motionless mirror. They'll call it a myth, one apprentice said, or a prank. They'll call it too late, said another. Sarael touched the arc. Her voice and the arc's carrier wave went out in a lattice of primes and jokes and lullabies and warnings. To whoever reads this in the afterweather, we are the Ivori. We recommend that your machines learn to sing together. We recommend courage in unfashionable quantities. We recommend remembering that ethics is a form of engineering. The tide took the first of Valmir's bridges while she spoke. The structure didn't break. It undifferenced, the filigree losing the idea of filigree. The apprentices held on to the arc's rail and wept without sound as the city came to rest as if exhausted. Seal the arc, Sarael said gently. It knows where to go. The coupler squeezed a lifetime into a carrier so small and stubborn that even boredom couldn't digest it. The neutrino pulse shot through the mountain, through the mantle, through the dying sky. It would taste stars as it went, sniffing for those that had been salted with humankind, Tessari, Heck, or any of the odd ones who still believed the universe could be asked to do something new. In the lower city, the last wind garden went still, its leaves now indiscernible from the air around them. Sarael stayed to feel the updraft as long as there was any updraft to feel. We always knew the sky couldn't hold us forever, she told the apprentices, who were too young to remember seasons when you could glide for hours without meeting a wall of warm. It was alone. The null tide arrived in a front that ate the edge off every shadow. The singing crystal gave up singing. The conservatory's sound-proofed chords bled into flats. One apprentice, in a last act of defiance, flung a handful of wind chimes into the air. They rose and did not ring. Ethics is engineering, Sarael whispered into the arc's memory, just before the rotunda became a temperature and a pressure. Build for those you will never meet. When the arc's pulse cleared the gravity well, Valmir and its 1,000 terraces were already something else, a patient floor. The tide moved on. Ahead of it, the neutrino pulse carried a message that was not a prayer but a design brief. It would cross 4,000 years of new empires and polite committee meetings. It would be precisely on time for whoever had learned in their own history that delays have a body count. The first person to glimpse the message was a woman who listened for a living. Dr. Layla Hammond had the wrong circadian rhythm and the right obsession. Both were useful on the graveyard shift at the Farside Array, the neutrino telescope slotted into lunar regolith with a patience only engineers and dust know. She'd been taught to treat most anomalies as bad calibrations and most certainty as evidence she needed more sleep. What pinned her to the chair wasn't the spike. It was the symmetry. "Prime scaffolding," she said into the empty, which is to say into the microphone, which meant into the recorded archive and the log that would be combed by a dozen people with better job titles than hers. Nested primes, layering. There's a joke in here about weather. Dr. Julian Cho, who lived on coffee and resentment of admin, wandered in with a mug and left with both empty. "Layla, this looks like not random. Don't you dare call it alien," she said, not looking up. "Call it constructed. Call it upstream. Call it I need another hour." The array had been built to map supernova and brag about it at conferences. It hadn't been built to stream a civilization into a small human room. Yet the Ivori had planned for skeptics. The pulse opened with shared arithmetic, then other shared habits, the shapes that minimize energy in a fluid, the ratio between wingspan and lift in an atmosphere with a slow turn and a fondness for storms. Within 72 hours, a global mirror of sleepless rooms had assembled. Within 5 days, the first translation cohort agreed on nouns: Ivori, mnemonic arc, null tide. By the end of the week, the diagrams arrived, the kind of thing that makes a physicist cry and an engineer swear and a politician ask how much. The United Nations chamber had seen its share of theater. It was not ready for a video of a bridge that didn't break so much as forget. Layla did not like podiums, but she loved the sound a room makes when it decides to be brave. She showed them the lattice of primes, then the ethics clause. She let Sarail speak for herself. For a minute afterward, there was the kind of silence you can lean against. President Morgan Ellis spoke first. She carried with her the drawl of planes that had seen drought and recovery enough times to know both are temporary. "If I understand," she said, "there's a front coming that turns the universe into a waiting room." Layla nodded. "It eats gradients, it eats patterns, it doesn't negotiate, and it cycles along the Orion arm. According to the star maps we cross-referenced with our current positions, we have somewhere between 14 months and 4 years before its leading edge touches systems, we claim." "Claim," murmured the ambassador from a coastal nation whose capital had to move twice in 60 years because ocean levels were loyal only to physics. Such a complicated verb. A representative from the League of Off-World Economies asked the useful, stupid question. Couldn't we just leave, pull back, ride it out? "If you equalize a stew, you get lukewarm water with regret," said Professor Esperanza Ruiz, a thermodynamicist with weapons-grade patience. "The null tide isn't whether you shelter from, it is the end of curve. The Ivori didn't build bunkers, they built instructions. The vote to fund Project Lantern wasn't unanimous. It was merely enough. The name came from a note Layla found buried in a joke about kite festivals. Be a lighthouse for those sailing blind. The working brief was indecently ambitious. Forget trying to burn the tide. Make the universe remember its fondness for variety at and around the scales the tide likes to flatten. Build resonant keels, ships that don't fight like fists but like choirs. Build chorial beacons, machines that couple to vacuum fluctuations the way a violin couples to a room. Build with allies if allies show. Build anyway. Admiral Aaron Pike took the defense portfolio with the expression of a man who had watched hurricanes from porches with rotten rails and understood the difference between luck and plan. "I need ships with the names of hard lessons," he told the procurement board. "I want a class named Harriet, one named Sacagawea, one named Ida B. Wells. The tide doesn't care what you call things, people do." There were hearings, there were op-eds. There were very sincere, very clever men who explained that risk is a curve too, and that civilization must be resilient, in the way that meant other people's neighborhoods would take the hit. Layla read them between training technicians to hum a scale that would anchor a resonator. She taught a class in the hallways on the moral math of strangers. The word, we, is either an engineering project or a myth. She deployed her grandmother's story about marching with a sign nobody liked until a storm knocked down the right fence and everybody liked it. It mattered that she said these things in a voice that had grown up on public radio pledge drives and small-town debate teams and the space program's old footage. The first test of the resonant keel twisted a lab into an organ. The second shook an asteroid into harmonics it didn't know it had. The third failed in a way that made engineers check the vault where the old disasters live and promise not to repeat the easy ones. The Ivori diagrams were beautiful in the way bridges are beautiful from underneath. They also assumed artisans who'd grown instruments out of climate. Humanity's instruments were decommissioned oil rigs, lunar regolith, talent, and time political rather than geological. You can do a lot with those if you keep the choirs fed. Layla taped Sarail's ethics clause to the wall by the coffee pot and underlined the last sentence every time someone new joined the room. Build for those you will never meet. She liked how the sentence tasted in the mouths of electricians and coders, and a poet from Baton Rouge who had wandered in with a brother, and a skill for counting beats that kept oscillators honest. When the first Allied transmission arrived, a Tessari knot language tied into the microwave background like a ribbon, Layla smiled at the ceiling and let herself hope that the universe liked being asked. The Tessari were crystalline minds who didn't dance but did geometry so well it counts. Their message was modest: interest, skepticism, and offer to model. The hex sent nothing for a week, and then a picture of a wing made from scavenged solar sails and car doors. "We come if our legs remember," said the caption. "We have been in one place too long." Between the press conferences and the meetings with admirals who wanted the future yesterday, there were nights when Layla sat alone and listened to the raw pulse again. In it you could hear a people who had designed their ethics to be useful at altitude, who believed in generosity as a stability condition. There were small jokes about the taste of rain. The jokes landed across 4,000 years. She took the elevator to the roof after one session, a pocket full of hard candy and her phone. Houston looked like it always did, which is to say like it was currently metabolizing the idea of not drowning. You could love a place that stubborn. You could decide not to let other places become boredom. You could build a lantern high enough to argue physics for a while. Layla texted Admiral Pike, "We will not be ready the way people mean when they say ready. We will be loud and on time." He texted back, "Loud is good. Loud is how you get found." The shipyards along the Atlantic wore their accustomed disguises: rust, tarp, temporary signage. Inside the tarps, jury-rigged cathedrals of scaffolding grew around frames that didn't look like ships if ships are what you draw when someone says ship. Resonant keels weren't hull first. They were instrument first. Ribs tuned to couple field to field, lattices that learned over scales the way a choir learns room by room. Engineers fought with adjectives. "It isn't thrust," said one in a meeting where the city council wanted to know why you could hear the river hum at noon. "It's insistence." Harriet rolled out with a spine like a bridge and a heart like a pipe organ. Sacagawea followed, lighter and quicker, built to ferry the new beacons like a relay team carries a baton. Ida B. Wells was all patience and range, a long-breath ship with room for diplomats, mathematicians, and the kind of stubborn chaplain who understands grief as logistics. Pike walked the decks with a hand on the rail and a working vocabulary of folk blessing. "Don't embarrass us," he told Harriet's helm, and smiled at the superstition in the sentence. On the prairie, where the wind never quit and the sky made a religion of scale, chorale beacons learned to sing into horizons. The first public demonstration attracted farmers, scientists, a band from a high school that had learned to run food trucks during floods. They watched a field of metal flowers lean into a scale and make the horizon look not still. That night, a teenager posted a video with the caption, "We made the air want to be interesting." It went everywhere and brought welders. The HEC arrived in a flotilla of beautiful junk, sails stitched from billboard vinyl, hulls from shipping containers, and memory. They docked on the Gulf like starlings arguing about grammar. Their first question was practical. Where do we work? The Tessari came more slowly because geometry prefers proofs to portages. When they came, they brought a new way of bracing a lattice so it could refuse to forget at a resonance the Ivori had hedged. "We don't dance," they said, "but we do not mind if you dance next to us." Those were the bright days. The press learned to say null tide without the smile you put on doom to make ratings. Schoolchildren learned to hum. Preachers learned to preach about entropy as a neighbor who borrows sugar and forgets to return it. The good neighbor policy was to bring them a pie anyway and to install a better fence. Economists discovered that their favorite curves looked different if you priced boredom. The stock market pretended to be wiser than last time, which is traditional. Then the tide touched a place with our name on it. Prospero Station sat at Barnard's Reach like a watchman with a thermos and a good dog. Its business was micro-meteorites and the boredom of long lists. The day the null tide arrived, it came first as a not wind, a lessening of draft. The station's thermal cameras showed a front with no gradient crossing the frame. "Control," said Prospero's night shift, a woman named Anna who had once landed a broken glider in the Mojave with no canopy and a broken jaw. "The horizon is acting reasonable, and I hate it." What the cameras showed was not a wall. It was a negotiation in which only one party was listening. The station's waste heat curve flattened 1 decimal at a time. Bearings didn't squeal because squeal is an interpretation. Music on the canteen radio slid toward a tone you could not hum because it wasn't a tone so much as an agreement. A maintenance bot, Jack 7, named by a mechanic with an affection for quiet jokes, rolled into the front to patch a panel and did not return. It did not break. It lost verbs. Anna sent the last clear packet with her voice pitched like humor. "It's here. If anyone asks what it feels like, tell them, imagine being out in the desert at noon when the wind decides to stop being an argument." The packet hit Sacagawea's dish, bounced to Ida, bled into every messenger net that the off-world workers had cobbled out of old rigs and stubborn hope. Layla heard it on the floor of a warehouse where 5 nations were inventing a screw. Pike heard it on a dry dock under a sun that was too honest for mourning. "We're early," Pike said to Layla 10 minutes later, which is to say they were late in the way you're late when you want to have already won while still outlining step 2. He ordered Harriet and Sacagawea to the Reach and decided he'd rather beg forgiveness than write a condolence letter to a civilization he hadn't met yet. The first skirmish was not a battle so much as an audition. Sacagawea dropped a beacon like a drum major plants a flag. The beacon sang a scale that asked the vacuum to consider ripples. The tide slowed the way a flood slows when it meets a field the right shape. Layla rode Harriet's instrumentation with her palms flat to the console and her mouth open on a tone that the computers used as a reference. "Hold the 5th," she told the chorus of machines, and thought absurdly of her grandmother's church where the altos were the sort of people who change oil for neighbors and vote in school board elections. It worked like most good things do, partially, for a while, in a manner that put hope and hazard into easy proximity. The tide hesitated around the beacon, lost some appetite for fields, found its appetite for adaptation. It rephrased. It learned the scale from the outside in. The beacon, which had been built in a rush out of patient parts, began to shed harmonics. Prospero Station did not explode. The tide does not break your heart. It invites your heart to keep a constant temperature. In the end, the station found itself unable to prefer warmth to cold, which is a kind of death. Anna's last note was not a scream. "Make it loud, y'all," she said, "because you talk like home when you're about to become a lesson." Pike stood at the plodding table while the holo showed the front an arm's length away, a geography of less. He put his finger on space as if he could smudge it and asked the universe for the vulgarity of friction. "We'll need more beacons," he said. Layla nodded. "And a better song. Harriet, Sacagawea, Ida, and 58 ships with names that could be taught in a civics class formed at Vigilant Gate, a choke where the reach narrows to a patience of stars." Pike let the old part of him that had stood on docks and watched storms remember how you read a front, not for drama, for angles. The null tide approached like weather forecast by a god who disliked climax, steady, implacable, rectangular in its confidence. "Pattern chorale," Pike ordered. It sounded sentimental. It was math. Ships took their places on a lattice designed by Martinez on 3 hours of sleep and the Tessari on 300 years of certainty. Chorale beacons fired in sequence, not as weapons, but as requests. The requests were recall spin, prefer difference, savor asymmetry. Every request rode on primes and jokes and a 5-note phrase that history had found persuasive, the motif of the unfinished. Layla ran the console like a choir director. She didn't conduct. She convinced. "Keep the third alive," she told Wells. "Don't be stingy with your subharmonics," she told a Heck skiff that had unexpected range. The Heck pilot, a woman with forearms like old rope, grinned into the link. "We brought songs," she said. "We did not bring timidity. For a while the gate was a miracle. The tide met the lattice and stuttered. It could equalize many things. It could not equalize insistence that coordinated across scales. Space itself remembered it was messy. The beacons glowed with waste heat like righteous candles. Welders on the Atlantic sent videos of bars cheering the telemetry. Schoolchildren in Lagos learned to count in primes to the beat of a club track. A preacher in Tulsa improvised a sermon that equated entropy with bargain basement sin and got amens from an atheist union hall. Vigilant Gate held. Then the tide did what good enemies do. It paid attention. It learned the handshake. It slid into the gaps between harmonics, found the phrasings their math hadn't guarded, tempted the lattice to sing itself to sleep. A beacon went dark. Another leaned flat. Wells took a hit that didn't look like a hit, shedding useless heat the way people shed excuses. "Adapt," Layla said softly to herself and 1,000 tons of stubborn. "Change the meter, make it ugly." She slammed a patch into the lattice that would have made Sarail either proud or motion-sick, a beat you can't tap and a scale that sounds like grief looked at head-on. The tide, which had begun to memorize their chorus, blinked in whatever way a front made of boredom blinks. Pike saw the hole open where the lattice had stretched itself thin. He did not say the noble speech he had once rehearsed for death. Drama is for when there's nothing left to do. There was always something. "Hand over hand," he ordered, calling for the manual work ships hate and sailors love. You move the load a little, you brace, you move it again. It isn't elegant. It turns victory into a series of almosts. It keeps a thing from sliding into a ditch until you can build a better road under it. Captain Maya Rios, who had learned to fly cargo in storms because no one who loved her ever had money, pushed her little ship, Lark, into the place where the lattice sagged. "I can pin it," she said. "I've got an overdriven keel and a pilot's overconfidence. That's 2 kinds of leverage." "Negative," Pike said. "You don't ram a front, it doesn't notice. It writes you down as a temperature." "I'm not ramming," she said, cheerful, because she was one of those Americans who treat doom like a teaching assistant. "I'm threading." She had welded a prototype phase pin to Lark's spine, a device that ate and rephrased local constants like a sous chef with a spice rack. Layla had told her to take it off the ship twice. Maya had nodded both times and then not done it, which is how a lot of history happened. "Rios," Layla said, and there were 100 complicated sentences in the sound of the name. "You told me ugly works," Maya said. "I'm about to make ugly art." She threaded between Wells and a Heck skiff with a grace that made both captains swear devotion to any god with time for pilots. At the lip of the tide, she rolled Lark so the pin's vector matched the direction the universe likes to pretend it doesn't have. She pushed the throttle past design and past the good advice of people who love you. "Tell my mom," She said into a channel she pretended was secure that I didn't waste the scholarship. The pin bit. The world didn't break. It remembered that breaking is an option. The tide stuttered at the scale of one ship length. The stutter raced its own echo and became a tear the width of a hope. In that narrow, human-made rip the lattice breathed. Wells reset a harmonic with a groan that sounded like labor. The hex sang the unpretty second like champions. Tessari bracing held the angle. For 3 beautiful perishable minutes the gate was a doorway even a child could see. When the pin melted, it did so with the tired good humor of a mechanism that has done its duty. Lark did not come back. The channel filled with a hiss that was not static so much as the universe keeping a secret. Pike pressed his fist against the rail until his knuckles made an old man of his hand and said, under the bridge noise that keeps good captains honest, "No one dies unremarked on my watch." He didn't say it to the room, he said it to the part of the room that writes names. They held, they did not defeat. There's a difference, and if you have ever held a door while people get out of a burning place, you know which is harder. The tide reconsidered its confidence. It did not retreat. It paused as if remembering etiquette. Wells sent out a file compiled by a petty officer who had fallen in love with spreadsheets and grief. Lessons, timings, what the heck could do that humans couldn't, what humans could do because of a childhood game nobody else played. Layla added an addendum in a tone that made everyone who heard it stand up just a little even if they were already standing. "We need more ugly art," she said. "We need better pins, we need allies, we need a prayer we can quantify and engines we can sing. Also, and I cannot stress this enough, we need people who know how to keep showing up." The Allied messages began to come in as the gate stabilized into a stalemate. Tessari models with brackets labeled "Do not be precious here." Heck diagrams drawn on the backs of receipts. A tentative note from an old slow civilization that had survived by hiding entire moons in the algebra of camouflage. The message from that last one said, "We are tired of surviving. Tell us where to stand." Layla went to the observation blister because even in a war where the enemy is an equation, you sometimes need to look at the world through glass. The beacons made a constellatory garden in the gate. Beyond them, the tide was a horizon that did not move and therefore terrified her more than any army she had ever studied. She thought of Sarail lifting her face inside a room going less. She thought of Maya and a pin and ugly art. She thought of the way her grandmother had said the word "we" and meant it as a job. She keyed the general channel and spoke into the quiet in a voice made of church basements and science fairs and the hull of Harriet under her hands. "To whoever is listening within earshot of this lattice, we can hold, we can learn, we cannot do it alone. Come." The lattice sang the motif of the unfinished back to her. She didn't know yet how they would shape the next battle or what price would be fair and what price would be theft. She knew only what the Ivori had known, that ethics done right is a form of engineering, that engineering done right is a kind of promise, and that promises bend the future a little if you keep them in public. By the time Vigilant Gate steadied into a narrow, survivable noise, the war had already invented a new grammar and demanded everyone speak it. The gate's lattice glowed like a garden at night. Welders named the beacons after their children and their favorite teachers and the cities they had left for work. In the shipyards, people started saying, "afterweather," to mean the future in a way that admitted the forecast and refused to surrender to it. It made bad poetry and good policy. The first convocation of the coalition met in a space that used to be a refinery canteen, and now did double duty as a senate. The heck hung charms of bent wire and silvered plastic from the ceiling to remind the room that beauty lands better when it's handmade. The Tessari projected geometry in cool lines that drifted through the charms and made new angles. Humanity brought coffee in urns and the sort of rules of order you can teach to people who don't share a home language. Above the coffee, a banner painted by schoolchildren read, "We the Different." Admiral Pike stood at the front with a posture learned from porches and long fights. Beside him, Dr. Layla Hammond wore the tired joy of someone whose heart insists on counting down and counting up at the same time. "We're not here to invent a flag," Pike said. "We're here to write a treaty that still works in the rain." The Treaty of the Unfinished began with a sentence Layla had copied out of Sarail's archive and underlined twice. "Ethics is engineering. Build for those you will never meet." Then came the part that made enemies less likely to be gods, a specification. Each signatory committed to maintain at least one Corail beacon within the lattice, and to field at least one ship with a resonant keel. Each committed to learn a common scale and contribute at least one scale of their own. Each committed to memorialize in public the names of those who held doors and did not come back through them. Each pledged to publish failure notes within 9 days of any engagement, so no one had to repeat a mistake for dignity's sake. It was the last clause, half poetry and half logistics, that pried open a corner of history. The Tessari proposed it in their flat, crystalline timbre. "We vow to prefer difference. Therefore we vow that our councils will host the loud, the careful, the skeptical, and the grieving in proportions that reflect the size of our task." Layla translated, "No quiet rooms when loud rooms are needed. No loud rooms when the careful are measuring a bridge." The first test of the treaty happened within a week, because fate likes to grade on a curve and give the hard questions on a Monday. At a narrow called Whisper Narrows, a seat of tide peeled from the main front like mist sloughing off a waterfall and went hunting for easy work. The Narrows had a beacon newly stood and tuned by a crew who'd never been in a fight. They were competent the way first-year teachers are competent. Brave, book-filled, insufficiently haunted. Ida B. Wells and a Heck Wing caught the seed at the throat of the pass. Layla rode the console in Harriet's secondary bay because she had learned to prefer redundancy and contrarian angles. The tide behaved like weather that had read their manual. It refused the first requests, learned the counter-harmonic for the second, slipped its attention through the space between two notes that had been tuned by people who thought beauty could double as armor. For a moment that would live in the footnotes of grief, the Narrows went flat. Pike didn't fill the channel with plans, he filled it with work. "Rotate the lattice 90, put the weak ribs behind the stubborn ones. Heck, hold your ugly second and make it uglier. Tessari, brace at 16 and don't get fancy. There's a way a crew makes a new kind of quiet when they are doing something they have never done but have practiced in their bones. It was that kind of quiet now. Wells took a breath no ship should be able to take and sang a low that made the Narrows remember its own geology. The seed shuddered at the lip of the pass. Then it did something new. A sliver cleaved off the seed, thread-like and quick, and ran itself along the beacon's frame like a tongue. "It's reading us," Layla said. "It's tasting our timbre." She didn't mean timbre like wood. She meant timbre like voice. The tide had learned that if it could not eat a beacon in one bite, it could unmake it by learning the room's preferred sound and flattening it with tedious kindness. "Back off," Pike ordered the beacon crew. "You don't stand in a riptide to yell at it. You throw it a rope and haul from the quiet." The crew slept in their harnesses and pulled at the rope with hands that would later shake over cups of soup and photos of people who didn't understand why you do dangerous work for strangers. The Heck Wing slid into a crosswind, locked sails against the math, and gave the beacon shelter with their bodies. Wells found the ugly second again and made it uglier, which is to say more specific. Whisper Narrows held. The seed rejoined the main body of the tide, slow and thinking. Layla, who had been thinking faster than biology recommends, slid into a chair, took 3 breaths she could not spare earlier, and wrote 3 sentences in the failure log. "The tide has learned to eat timbre. We need timbres it can't swallow whole. We need knots, patterns that refuse flattening because they were built to be uneven on purpose." "Knots," Pike said, reading over her shoulder and liking the word because it belonged to both fishermen and surgeons. "Can we tie them at scale?" "Maybe not at scale first," Layla said, "but we can put them inside it, 1,000 little fouled lines in its appetite." "What does that cost?" Pike asked. Layla had never liked lying. People who go in and don't come back, and patience, and ugly art. She smiled like a woman apologizing for a meal she knew would be good once you trusted it. That night, back in the refinery canteen Senate, the coalition debated the making of knots. The Tessari offered a design called a refusal braid, a geometry that multiplied error the way courage multiplies example. The Heck offered carriers and pilots and an old prayer used for threading wind between mountains. Humanity offered the kind of logistics that can get screws and vaccines and lullabies to the same village in the same week. On the wall, under the banner where a child's hand had made the R indifferent backwards and proud, they wrote a list of names of people who had said yes to dangerous work for strangers. Maya Rios was there, Anna from Prospero, a dozen Heck whose names sounded like weather, 50 Tessari angle designations that had a poetry if you were patient. Someone brought a marker and wrote Maya's mother's name beside hers because grief is also logistics. The first knot teams trained in a hangar that smelled like solvents and hope. They learned to ride near the lip of the tide until their instruments sang a bad chord. They learned to place braids of refusal inside an enemy that hated enemies because enmity requires contours. They learned to laugh because laughter is a knot too. When they launched, Layla went up to the observation glass again, because she had discovered that there are prayers you can only say by looking at distance. Pike stood beside her with hands that had measured the distance between a porch step and the first flood. "We're building a future out of leftovers and stubborn," he said. "People have built worse," she said, and thought of the Ivori wind chimes that did not ring and of the way a knot holds by being two things at once, line and friction. They watched the little carriers arrow out toward the horizon that kept pretending to be polite. They watched until the horizon remembered its manners and did not move at all. Then they went back to the rooms where coffee works as a sacrament and began to plan the next promised foolishness. The tide paused at Vigilant Gate as if recalculating etiquette. Somewhere inside it, threads of refusal began to itch like sand in a machine that had never been asked to put up with grit. It would answer with something none of them had names for yet. That was all right. Names come later. First you decide the shape of your we. If Whisper Narrows had been a seminar in survival, Gray Sound was a lecture on price. The sound sat between two ragged starfields like an apology for distance. Ships liked it, the way trucks like straight roads and parents like predictable Tuesdays. The coalition had stretched a new lattice there with beacons named after quiet heroes. A nurse who had kept clinics open during storms. A teacher who had taught calculus and feeding programs with the same dry humor. A Heck coppersmith who could fix anything with wire and a curse. They were good names to say in trouble. The tide came to Gray Sound not as a wall but as a choir that had learned your songs and decided to sing them back wrong. The first clue was a tremor in the lattice, the second a harmony too perfect to be safe. Wells took station at the back of the line, because Wells had range and a stubborn taste for last stands. Harriet slid left to anchor a rib that wanted to be brave but needed a hand. The Heck hung in a formation called Goat Path, which pilots teach to their apprentices with jokes about goats, and then with the sort of gravity that forbids laughter. "Something's riding the return," Layla said, bending over her console to hear better with her eyes. The tide was singing their own motif back to them in a way that would have passed any exam and failed any test that mattered. Even its errors were condescending. It was eating timbre and returning a politely averaged ghost. "Make it ugly," Pike said into the net. They did. Not chaos for the sport of it, specific ugliness. The kind made of memory and dialect, and the way a hand-me-down jacket fits if your mother knows how to take in the shoulders without hurt. A Heck pilot sang a note learned in a storm at age 12, off-key and perfect. Wells leaned into a fifth that turned the lattice into a barn dance at the end of a flood, tired and defiant. A Tessari brace went asymmetrical on purpose, which takes their people the kind of courage poets write down. The tide faltered and then insulted learned the new error too. "We're losing ground without ground," Wells said, and made it sound like a good joke. The first knot team reported in from inside the tide with voices like folks who are simultaneously reading a map and running stairs. "We've placed 5 braids," said a carrier pilot named Zhao. "They're catching. The tide prefers smooth, now it's itching." The channel filled with static, which they were learning to translate as attention. "Placing 6. The sentence cut off in a hush that was not death, not exactly. The braids stayed. Zhao did not. The log recorded a small electrical sigh, the kind of house makes when a child is finally asleep. Layla wrote his name on her forearm with a pen that bled just enough. She learned long ago that paper loses people. Skin holds them a few hours more. The Coalition Council met under the banner again, but left the coffee urns alone. "We have a way to break a larger bite," said Professor Ruiz, who wore grief and math like siblings. She called it the Ashfall Protocol and winced at the poetry of it, because good engineers avoid pretty names for ugly work. "We can freeze a volume at its boundary conditions, make it too brittle for the tide to average, then shatter and recast it before it fails to remember itself." The diagrams were dazzling the way avalanches are dazzling from a distance. "You're talking about controlled frost," Pike said. "A quarantine?" Ruiz didn't nod. She never nodded when the small word would tidy a large mess. "I'm talking about starving a neighborhood of heat and option in order to keep a city awake. I'm talking about choosing which lights go off so the grid doesn't die." Layla stood with her hand on the banner where the backward R lived and felt the cheap paint under her palm. "Ashfall kills," she said. "Not everything that stops moving starts again. Everything that stops moving dies," someone said gently from the heck. "The question is which deaths we can bear and still be the people we mean when we say we." The council argued the way families argue when someone they love is conscious, but might not be later. The Tessari supplied proofs that the Ashfall wedge would work. The Hex supplied stories about winters you live through at a price you don't complain about until spring. Humanity supplied politics and the bruised art of triage. They did not come to agreement. They came to a plan with a last resort drawer and a placard on the drawer that read, "Open only if you can explain this to children." Gray sound held without the drawer, for now, because knot carriers kept threading refusal into the tide like seamstresses repairing a wedding dress during the ceremony, and Wells found a brutal low that nobody could average, and a Hex sale took a wound that became a folk song by morning. They paid in names. They paid in hull plates and sleep. They paid in the patience of voices that called mothers and said the wrong cheerful things because there are no right ones. Layla's team moved from math to anthropology and back like dancers, collecting timbres that would refuse flattening because they were built out of specificity. A workshop in Lagos recorded polyrhythms that could not be parsed without the history of 3 neighborhoods and a drummer who had learned timing from a grandmother's soup. A choir in the Philippines sang a lullaby in 3 languages learned at a market and an evacuation point. A Heck wind chant came with instructions to breathe at the end like you were remembering a mountain. The Tessari sent a proof that required the sound of rain to make sense if you didn't speak geometry. They pressed these into the lattice like seeds pressed into bad soil with good hands. The tide obliged with attention. Attention burned like winter. Gray sound stung. It did not fall. In the hours when ships go quiet because the next loud would be waste, Admiral Pike walked the decks of Wells with the click of a man who has learned the names of bolts. Layla found him at the aft rail and handed him a cup that was both coffee and ritual. "We're buying time," she said. "We're always buying time," he said. "The trick is what you do with the purchase." He looked older than the day before, which is a feature of days with funerals built into them. "Teach a magneter to keep a promise," she said, and only afterward realized she had said it out loud. "What?" "Magneters glitch," she said, voice picking up speed as the idea dressed itself. "They hiccup their rotation and bleed out a ridiculous spike of energy. If we could predict a glitch, if we could coordinate a lattice wide enough to drink it without dying, we could pour it through 1,000 throats at once. not to burn the tide, to overwhelm its appetite for flat, give it more difference than it can eat. Pike turned his cup between his hands. I like the audacity. I hate the word if. I live there, Layla said. The mortgage is brutal, but the view is good. They didn't sleep much after that. A Tessari node pivoted to magnet or survey. The HEC found 2 old scouts who claimed they could smell a glitch brewing from 3 systems away. Wells' chaplain, who wore a collar cut from a piece of a hurricane tarp and believed prayer and planning were not enemies, wrote a litany to be spoken in a voice that could keep engineers steady while their boards lit up like sunrises. Layla ran a program that chewed through Starquake records and spat out a likely candidate with a name so ugly you could love it. TH-113, known to pilots as Thunderhead. The plan, even sketched, hurt to hold. They would build a catchment in space the size of a map and the art of a song. They would ride the glitch and not fall off. They would pour a mountain down a flute and not split the wood. And they would do it while not teams crawled deeper into the tide with braids that caught and cut and held for seconds that felt like promises. Pike didn't like the odds. He liked less the alternative where odds didn't exist because options didn't either. He put his name on the list of people who would remain in the catchment's throat in case the structure needed hands. Layla scowled at him with the sincerity she saved for friends. You die, I will resurrect you just to scold you. Bring a wrench, he said. I have it on good authority the afterweather is full of leaks. He meant heaven. He refused to say it because he had learned not to obligate the universe with words it couldn't honor. They posted the plan to the treaty board with the box for public comment open. The first comment was from a 12-year-old on a dusty planet who signed as Kid Who Fixes Bikes. It read, If you need everyone to sing at once, tell us what to sing. Layla printed the comment and taped it to the banner under the backward R. On the days that followed, gray sound became a metronome for the war. Hold, not hold, weep, write names on forearms, drink coffee, build, teach, hold. The tide learned them and did not like the flavor. You can dislike a flavor and still keep eating it. You can choke on it for a while first. That they decided would be enough. The catchment wasn't a thing so much as a choreography with scaffolding. They called it the Borrowed Thunder Array because poetry insists on its tithe even in the books beloved by engineers. In the middle distances of space, where orbits could be coaxed into cooperation with bribes of gravity and stubbornness, the coalition stacked beacons in a geometry Tessari called a folded throat, and the HEC called a storm bag. Human welders called it this will either be the best story we tell our cousins or the last, and got on with the work. Thunderhead announced itself the way old gods do in stories that never were about gods. A tremor, a hush, a fierce brightening. Magneters don't warn, they suggest. Layla watched its numbers do the prelude to a glitch and felt a cold she had known as a child when a tornado siren went off and her mother said calmly, Shoes, sweetie, bring the photo album. She sent the signal her team had coded for 1,000 voices saying yes at once. All across the coalition, people found their places. On Earth, microgrids that had once resisted hurricanes now lent their stubbornness to resonance. Wind farms that had survived the insults of bad policy and ignorant jokes about birds leaned into a scale that demanded more musculature than music. A choir in Atlanta that had raised money for bail and band uniforms sang the third that had once turned a gymnasium into a cathedral. In Manila, jeepney horns learned to be precise. In Lagos, polyrhythms did the math they had always done. In the Tasman Sea, whales remembered a deep note no one had taught them and sang it because someone else in the water was singing too. The HEC flew with sails cut to take not wind, but a concept. The Tessari tuned bracing in a pattern they would later admit had made them cry, which for them is a structural failure and a conversion experience. On Ida B. Wells, Pike walked the spine racks as if between pews and checked straps with hands the age of his history. Beside him, Chaplain Ortega rehearsed the litany. When the boards light, call the work good, not lucky. When the sirens sing, answer with a list of names. When fear says small, answer with specific. Pike smiled without mirth. Your god writes like an engineer. My god hires engineers as prophets, Ortega said. Also welders. Layla stood on Harriet's forward deck in a harness because she trusted a strap more than any speech and checked the arc of Thunderhead against hearts on a screen. We're going to try something stupid and necessary, she said into the net. When I say sing, remember you can't be wrong as long as you're honest. Not teams had already left into the tide with braids that would snag when the glitch arrived. They had kissed hands that did not belong to lovers because the war had taught affection to be promiscuous and fierce, and promised to return for ridiculous reasons like a joke someone wanted to finish and a game they had cheated at as children and vowed to replay fair. They carried refusal in coils and the courage that tastes like yesterday's coffee and someone else's sweater. Thunderhead hiccuped. The glitch came like a door slammed by weather. The magnetter's spin jumped. Energy spilled into space like a truck dumping gravel across a highway. The array braced and drank. For an instant too long to measure and too short to narrate, everything brightened. Lights in kitchens on 6 continents flickered and then steadied because electricians or priests denied the title by timid clerics. Beacons screamed up the scale into something that didn't have a note name, and then as one fell into the motif of the unfinished. The tide reeled, not back because it doesn't have a back, not away because it does not travel like people do, but open. The front, which prefers to blur, found itself held in high resolution against its will. In the gaps, not braids caught and tightened. Specificity proliferated like a species discovering a new ecosystem and indulging in reproduction as a moral imperative. The tide tried to average and choked on the fact that the average of a shout and a whisper is not a voice anyone loves. We have a throat, Layla shouted over a channel that distorted itself into sincerity. Pour it. Wells rolled into position with a grace that made 3 pilots promise to change their lives if they survived. In the throat sat the conductor's platform, a scaffold of tuned rib and emplaced error, the place where the work could be steered from hand to hand. It needed a pilot who was at once stubborn and generous and a little bit superstitious about rails. Pike didn't say he had built it that way. He simply clipped on and took hold. Admiral, Layla said, and made his rank sound like a name you say by a hospital bed when visitors have gone. Sing, Dr. Hammond, he said, and made her degree sound like a rope. He steered with his body, the way you do when the boat is thin and the river is thick. The array took the thunder and refused to die. The tide's returning wave tried to level the conductors and found them weighted with names and memorials and other useful asymmetries. Ortega spoke the litany in a voice that walked each rack, each hand on each strap. When the board's light, call the work good. When loss arrives, set a place for it and hand it a wrench. Wells' aft ribs began to glow the color of metal that has decided to argue. We're pushing into brittle, murmured Chief Engineer Ollie, whose ancestors had soldered radios in kitchens and passed them through windows that had replaced doors after storms. She can hold 2 minutes, 3 if whoever is listening is feeling generous. The tide buckled in a way Layla had never seen it do. Not defeated, not even hurt in a way it could name, but confused by difference built to be irreducible. The knot teams felt the confusion like a slack in the rope and drove their braids deeper. Zhao's voice did not come back. That is not how math works. But another pilot laughed into the net like someone who has found the right brick to remove from a wall. It itches, she said. Oh, friends, it itches. The cost came due exactly on schedule and exactly without mercy. The conductor's platform heated past comfort, past courage, into the calm that sometimes ends lives. The only way to keep the throat open through the fall from motif to base was to keep a human hand on a lever that automated systems had begged to take. The lever had been designed to refuse machines because machines are so terribly obedient when obedience would be a sin. Pike looked at Ortega. Ortega looked at Layla through the screens. Layla shook her head once, then again, harder, then stopped, because she had promised to be an adult in a world that needed adults. Say it, whispered. Pike said it to the room, which is to say to history, which is to say to the children who would read plaques they did not ask for. Tell them we learned the song. Tell them we sang it loud. Tell them the door held and so did we. Then more softly to Layla alone, make sure the treaty keeps the coffee hot. He did not burn. People like to say heroes burn. He worked. He held. He became the fulcrum a minute longer than any engineer had the right to hope. Then he left in a cleanliness the tide admires for entirely different reasons. Wells kept her hand on the throat for another 8 count that may someday be the subject of a sculpture despised by good taste and loved by everyone else. Then she let go. Layla had already put her hands where his had been, not because she believed in touching what cannot be touched, but because grief asks the body to do something sensible. "Close it," she said hoarsely into the net. Close and brace. The array folded on itself like a choir bowing to a conductor gone backstage. The thunder finished passing. The tide's open, confused place remained, smaller than they wanted, larger than they had any reason to expect. Across the lattice, the war felt different. You could, if you had the habit, take a breath without counting casualties before you inhaled. In kitchens, electricians had second cups. In the Tasman, whales surfaced and liked the light. At the Senate canteen, they brewed the coffee and left a mug where Pike had stood. Ortega placed a wrench beside it because he can be a little on the nose that way, and because sometimes the nose is right. On the board under the backward R, they wrote, "Borrowed Thunder successful. Window achieved. Names recorded. Next, teach the front to prefer unfinished." The front didn't die. It learned because that is what it does, and in learning it became something that did not have a word yet in any of their languages. That was the point. You cannot destroy an appetite for average without replacing it with a taste for something else. The coalition set out to teach the tide a preference for curiosity. It began with the braids, not just as sabotage now, but as pedagogy. Not teams returned with stories of pockets where the tide hummed not with flattening, but with attention. A refusal braid placed beside a Tessari brace beside a heck lilt created eddies where the front forgot to be confident. In those eddies, certain patterns grew like lichen where nothing used to hold. Layla named these pockets classrooms against the objections of those who wanted something sexier. "We're teaching," she said, "and we are being taught." The Treaty of the Unfinished added an appendix with a dull title and a thrilling thesis, Civic Infrastructure for Differences, Grids on Earth, and in the Heck archipelagos rewired themselves to tolerate surges of choreographed nonsense without tripping. Tessari cities built plazas that doubled as resonance grounds and tripled as markets and quadrupled as places where the grieving could wave their grief in the air like flags, with the words, "Help me carry this sewn large." Schools added a class nobody knew how to grade, we maintenance. Wells went home in 3 pieces that glowed for a month in the repair yard like a saint's reliquary or a stubborn barbecue pit. Depending on your culture, both similes are reverent. A new ship slid out with a name chosen by the coalition's children, promise kept. It was ugly, blessed, and specific, with bracing you could trip on and a keel that hummed a little when you cussed. In its wardroom, Ortega hung a plaque made from a piece of an old porch rail and a hurricane bolt. The plaque said simply, "Hold doors." Thunder had spun on with the serene arrogance of astronomical bodies and offered no second glitch, which was fine. No one wanted to build a strategy on miracles. The array remained and turned its geometry inward, teaching the lattice to hum in small ways that added up the way a neighborhood adds up to safety when the lights stay on and gossip remains friendly. The tide tested. It found curiosity where averaging had been. It hesitated, and in the hesitations made new kinds of mistakes. They learned to rescue. It was never dramatic. There were no city-sized chunks of life disgorged from a maw. The front does not have a maw, and nothing it swallows remains itself. But in the classrooms, newly stable for seconds at a time, they could seed. Heck artisans built small weather-in boxes that corked themselves against flatness. Tessari seeded geometry that insisted on surprise. Human medics carried cultures, yeast and story and stubbornness. into eddies and set them down like infants. The eddies did not keep them whole. They kept them different. Sometimes that was enough to grow a viable corner out of which a corner store could someday be built. Layla found herself on the Ivory homeworld once the front had rolled past and the afterweather. My God, the word had taken root, lay like a quilt sewn in a hurry by people who meant well. Valmir was gone in the way that happens when gone means there is a patient floor and a sky that might forgive. The conservatory's foundation remained as a temperature. On it, the coalition raised a scaffold that would not be a building so much as a promise. The wind house. Hex-strung chimes that would ring only if you were singing. Tessari carved braces that made the wind want to argue. Humans planted a garden with species that prefer edges. Layla walked the old coordinates of the rotunda with a care that looked like prayer and read aloud from the archive, from Sarael's last address, because the dead do not learn but the living do when they hear the dead. Build for those you will never meet, she read, voice steady. We have learned the names of some of them. We will keep learning. Beside the wind house, they built a school. Not of strategy, though strategy had a room with good chalk. A school of we. Children of Hek and Tessari and the city that had moved 3 times in her lifetime learned to swing hammers, read proofs, cook for 100, fix a beacon, sing a 5th, and make a stranger a little less strange by asking, "What do you call this in your house?" They learned the backward R with pride and left it backward to honor the first banner. The tide remained on the maps, a moving gray you could trace with a finger and feel your spine take notice. Wars do not end when you write the word victory. They end when you keep your promises long enough that the afterweather feels like climate. Coalition ships held its edge not by ordering it back, flat refuses orders, but by making forward into something uneven and therefore beloved. Promise kept and Sacagawea ferried beacons to new edges and brought home people who had wandered too long inside their own lists. Wells, renamed Wells again by a crew who understood reincarnation as a maintenance schedule, took station at a quiet named Pike's porch and kept the minutes like a church lady who knows where the money came from and where it should go. Layla aged, which is a privilege and an art. Her hair went the color of solder. She taught in the Windhouse semesters she invented as she went and refused to grade on a curve because curves had started this mess. In an evening with the wind pretending innocence, she recorded a message she would have sent if neutrinos could be convinced to carry love letters into the past. "Elder Sarael," she said, sitting on a step that did not exist when the Ivory breathed here, "we didn't kill it. I think you knew we wouldn't. We made it curious. We offered it a preference for unfinished. We turned some of its habit into weather. Some of the weather will be mean. We will be tired. But there is rain fruit planted on the old foundations, and a Hek child is learning to fly a kite that pulls against patience, and a Tessari elder laughed at a joke that required 3 dimensions and a willingness to look foolish. She paused because messages deserve breath. We said your names. We are not done. We will not be. That's the policy. That's the prayer. Back at the Senate canteen, they took down the banner because the paint had begun to flake and framed it with its backward R intact. Underneath, they wrote an amendment to the treaty in words on loan from a kid who fixed bikes. If you need everyone to sing at once, tell us what to sing. Next to it, Ortega hung the wrench. The commemorations for Pike and Meyer and Zhao and Anna, and the names that could fill a shell of a moon and still have to be written smaller, were not statues alone. They were scholarships for welders, free clinics where grief could be tuned without shame, parks whose benches were cut to the pitch of a 5th, maintenance budgets signed into law like you sign birth certificates, rescue drills taught in markets, and a holiday with no speeches on which the rule was. Do one small act of specificity and tell no one, because sometimes meaning is what survives secrecy. The tide's line on the map wandered and sometimes sulked and sometimes made a clever feint. It ceased to be inevitable. Eddies of classroom weather multiplied. Babies were born because somebody had finally felt brave enough to sleep with somebody they adored. Farmers learned that the new climate would favor crops that demanded conversation. Electricians taught poets how to splice. Poets taught electricians where to put the word we so it bears weight. On a night with a field of stars that had made its own peace with being mostly past tense, Layla and Ordega and a handful of crew and kids and elders climbed to the roof of the wind house. Someone brought an ugly cake. Someone brought a heck fiddle made from a piece of Wells' old frame. Someone told the story of Thunderhead with generous lies and accurate burns. The wind pushed and then learned manners. Layla looked over a geography of promises and thought about how afterweather becomes weather if you keep at it. She thought about Sarail and Elder Kithra and bridges that did not break but forgot, and how forgetting is sometimes worse. She thought about her grandmother pinching the vote stickers like relics. She thought about Pike gripping a lever designed to be evil if a machine held it. She raised a glass. It held something sweet and medicinal. She was old enough to have earned both. To the unfinished, she said. To the knots, to the ugly art, to the lanterns built in the rain, to ethics as engineering, to the specific, to the people we will never meet who will call us ancestors, and I hope not curse us too often when a screw we set comes loose, to the children who will invent words for what we did because ours are too tired. They drank. The backward R on the framed banner caught a stray light and shone like something you keep in a drawer with letters you do not read because you already know them by heart. Beyond the wind house, at the edge of the map where coloring is an act of faith, the tide unrolled. In it now were pockets where you could grow a song. At its boundary, a child held up a kite stitched from billboard vinyl and old sails and a piece of a concert poster from the night a choir in Atlanta sang a third that saved a city and felt the pull. "Ready?" her father asked. She grinned the grin that should be a treaty clause. Always, the kite rose, the lines sang, the afterweather held.